Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a trip up north
Oh, yeah.
to Canada, to Quebec specifically, and back in time to 2012.
Right.
Now, you might think you've had some bad days, but imagine walking into a warehouse, expecting to see, well, millions of dollars worth of maple syrup,
Okay.
only to find that it has completely vanished.
Oh, no.
Our deep dive today is going to be looking into what has been called the Great Canadian Maple Syrup Heist.
Wow.
We're going to be uncovering not just the how, but also the why
Mm-hmm.
behind this audacious crime.
I think this one's going to be a good one. It really is a fascinating story, and it goes way beyond just sticky fingers
Right,
or missing pancakes.
right.
This case touches on the cultural significance of maple syrup in Quebec. It touches on the economics of a tightly controlled industry, and even raises questions about the balance between regulation and individual freedom.
Okay, so let's set the scene here. Could
Yeah.
you maybe explain for our listeners just how deeply rooted maple syrup is in Quebec's culture?
Yeah. Absolutely. Maple syrup production in Quebec, it goes back centuries, originating with the indigenous peoples of the region, like the Abenaki
Yeah.
and the Micmac.
Okay.
They were the first to recognize the potential
Mm-hmm.
of those maple trees. And they transformed that sap into this liquid gold that we all know and love.
Yeah.
So for them and for generations of Quebecois since, maple syrup is far more than just a sweetener. It's an integral part of their identity.
Yeah, I've always loved those images of the sugar shacks, the cabans à sucre, they call
Yeah.
them. They always look
Yeah.
like so festive and fun. Such a great tradition.
Absolutely. These sugar shacks are a cornerstone of Quebecois culture. People gather there every spring. They celebrate the harvest, enjoy traditional meals, often drenched in maple syrup,
Oh, yeah.
and just revel in that unique atmosphere. It's a true cultural touchstone, deeply intertwined with community, heritage, and a love for this natural bounty.
Our sources mention, though,
Yeah.
that it's not all sweetness and light. When it comes to actually making a living from maple syrup,
Right.
it sounds like a tough business to be in.
You're right. Producing maple syrup is incredibly challenging. The success of each harvest relies heavily on factors that are totally outside the producer's control.
Oh, wow.
Everything from the weather conditions to the quality of the sap, even the timing of the season, really impacts the yield and the quality of the final product. So it can be very unpredictable, and relying solely on maple syrup for income can be quite risky for these farmers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So to mitigate that risk and maybe bring some stability, the Quebec maple syrup producers, or the QMSP, came into the picture, right?
Exactly. Founded in 1966, you can think of the QMSP as the guardians of the maple syrup universe. They set quotas for production. They manage pricing. They generally work to ensure a level playing field for everyone involved. But there's one thing they do that I find particularly interesting,
Okay.
almost like a plot point straight out of a spy thriller.
Oh, really? What is that?
They manage a massive strategic reserve of maple syrup.
Wait, a strategic reserve? Like, are we talking about a maple syrup Fort Knox here?
That's a great analogy. They have a huge warehouse. It's stocked with barrels upon barrels of syrup worth millions of dollars, all carefully controlled. Wow, it's like a national treasure.
Yeah.
And they use this reserve to regulate supply, maintain price stability, and ensure that they can meet demand, even in those lean years. In fact, in 2011, they had such a surplus of syrup that they actually decided to bolster the reserve, stockpiling even more of their liquid gold in a warehouse in Saint-Louis-de-Blanford.
Okay, so it sounds like they were playing it safe. But little did they know, things were about to take a very sticky turn. Our sources say that in July of 2012, an inspector made a shocking discovery. During a routine check, he was climbing a stack of barrels, you know, those massive containers, each holding about 600 pounds of syrup, and suddenly one of them nearly toppled over. That's when he knew. Something wasn't right. You know, those barrels should have been incredibly heavy, almost impossible to budge.
Yeah.
So what did he find inside those barrels? Was it the liquid gold they were expecting?
Unfortunately not. What they found was a shocking void. Some of the barrels were completely empty. Others were deceptively filled with water,
Really?
cleverly disguised to maintain the weight.
Right.
And there were even some barrels that were oddly dirty and rusty, which is unusual because pure maple syrup shouldn't oxidize like that. So it became clear very quickly that this was no accident. This was a heist of epic proportions.
So just how much of this liquid gold had disappeared?
Prepare yourself. This wasn't just a few missing jugs of syrup. The thieves had made off with an astonishing 2,700 tons of maple syrup. That's over 6 million pounds,
Wow.
valued at almost $18 million. It was gone, vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a sticky residue. and a whole lot of questions.
That's incredible to pull off something this massive. You'd think you'd need a team of professional thieves, maybe a maple syrup version of Ocean's 11.
You might be surprised. But before we get into who was behind this audacious plan, let's take a moment to consider the scale of this operation. It wasn't a smash and grab. This was a carefully planned and executed heist, carried out over months, right under the noses of the QMSP.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to think that someone managed to infiltrate this Fort Knox of maple syrup and pull off such a long con.
Right. And the fact that they were able to move and sell such a massive quantity of stolen goods without raising any red flags is remarkable. We'll delve deeper into the how and the why behind the sweet crime in part 2.
All right, well, I'm ready for the next part. All right, so we've got this Fort Knox of maple syrup, and suddenly millions of dollars worth of the stuff goes missing. What did the investigation reveal about who might be behind this sweet heist?
Well, the Sûreté du Québec, that's the provincial police force in Quebec.
Yeah.
They quickly realized that this wasn't just some, random break-in. The lack of forced entry, the fact that the thieves specifically targeted, the strategic reserve, all of that pointed towards something more, intricate, more calculated, had all the hallmarks of an inside job.
Yeah, that makes sense. You would need someone with knowledge of the warehouse layout, the security protocols, maybe even the QMSP's procedures to pull this off, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so they began focusing on individuals who had access to the warehouse, people familiar with the ins and outs of the maple syrup world. And as they dug deeper, they came across a figure who becomes central to this whole story, a man known as a barrel roller named Richard Valliere.
Barrel roller, that sounds like something out of a classic Western movie.
I know, right?
What exactly does that entail in the world of maple syrup?
Well, think of them as like wheeler dealers.
Yeah.
They're operating in the gray areas of the industry. They might bend the rules a little, find loopholes, maybe even skirt around the QMSP's regulations altogether. They're known for their resourcefulness, their connections, and their ability to kind of move product outside of the usual channels. And it turned out that Richard Valliere, he had a reputation as one of the most skilled and perhaps most daring barrel rollers around.
So he knew how to play the game, but maybe decided to rewrite the rules entirely.
That's the picture that emerged. According to the investigation, Valliere's, along with a network of accomplices, had orchestrated this elaborate scheme over months. They were siphoning syrup from the reserve barrels, replacing it with water to avoid detection, and then spiriting the stolen goods away to be sold on the black market. It was audacious, meticulous, and incredibly profitable.
Yeah, it's almost hard to believe that they managed to pull it off for so long without anyone noticing. But what was their motivation? Were they purely driven by profit, or was there something more to their actions?
Well, profit was undoubtedly a factor. Some of those involved in the heist claimed that they were motivated by a sense of rebellion against the QMSP's control over the industry. They argued that the quotas and regulations imposed by the QMSP were too restrictive. They were stifling competition and making it difficult for smaller producers to thrive.
So in their minds, they were fighting back against a system that they perceived as unfair. But stealing millions of dollars worth of maple syrup seems like a pretty extreme way to make a point.
It definitely raises questions about the means justifying the ends, and while some might sympathize with the frustrations that these producers felt, resorting to criminal activity, no matter the justification, ultimately undermines the industry as a whole.
It also creates an atmosphere of distrust. If buyers can't be sure the syrup they're getting is legitimate, the whole system starts to crumble.
Right, and it's important to remember that these actions had real consequences. Some of the recovered syrup was deemed unsafe for consumption because of the way it was handled and transported, so it had to be destroyed. And that's a loss for everyone involved, the producers, the buyers, and the industry as a whole.
So how did they manage to move and sell such a massive amount of stolen syrup? It's not like you can just walk into a supermarket and offer them a truckload of black market maple syrup.
No, they had to be clever about it. They established a network for laundering the stolen goods. They shipped the syrup to New Brunswick, a province with a less regulated maple syrup industry. From there, they blended the stolen syrup with legitimate product, and they sold it across Canada and even into the United States, raking in millions of dollars in illicit profits.
Wow, that's a pretty sophisticated operation. But you can't hide something like this forever. Did the authorities manage to catch up with these maple syrup bandits?
Oh, yes. The investigation was relentless. The police conducted over 300 interviews, executed 40 search warrants, painstakingly followed the trail, of this sticky loot across provincial borders. It was a complex and challenging investigation. But ultimately, they managed to track down much of the stolen syrup and bring those responsible to justice.
So what happened to the masterminds behind this whole operation, Richard Valliere and his crew? Did they manage to get away with their sweet crime?
Not quite. Valliere, along with several of his accomplices, was arrested and charged with theft, fraud, and trafficking stolen goods. And in a fittingly ironic twist, he was ultimately sentenced to over 7 years in prison. He traded the sweet taste of maple syrup for the bitter reality of a prison cell.
Wow, that's quite the fall from grace. It sounds like justice was served, but this whole case seems to raise bigger questions.
Absolutely. You know, beyond the intrigue of the heist itself, this case really shines a light on the complexities of a tightly controlled industry, the tensions between regulation and individual freedom, and the lengths people will go to when they feel the system is rigged against them.
Yeah, it really is a story that captures the imagination. I mean, who would have thought that maple syrup, of all things, would be at the center of such an elaborate heist?
And it's not just the audacity of the crime that's captivating. It's also those ripple effects that it had on the industry and the questions that it raises about how we manage and regulate, these valuable resources.
So beyond the thrill of the chase, what would you say are some of the key takeaways from this sticky situation?
Well, I think one of the biggest things this heist exposes is that tension between regulation and individual freedom, not just in the maple syrup world, but really in any market. Where supply and demand are carefully controlled. You have the QMSP, which was designed to protect the industry, stabilize prices, and ensure fairness for producers. But that level of control can also create a sense of restriction.
Okay.
A feeling of being boxed in for something.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Stability on one hand, but a sense of frustration.
And lack of autonomy on the other. Exactly. And that's where things get complicated. While some producers might see the QMSP as a necessary force for good, others might feel that their individual rights and freedoms are being infringed upon, and this can lead to resentment. And in extreme cases, even illegal activities like this heist.
It makes you wonder, where do you draw the line? Is there a way to balance the need for regulation with the desire for individual autonomy? And is stealing ever justified, even if you believe the system is working against you?
That's a tough question, and there are no easy answers. But it's definitely a conversation we need to be having, not just in the context of maple syrup, but in any industry, where power dynamics and resource allocation come into play.
Yeah, and it's also a reminder that even something as seemingly simple and sweet as maple syrup can be tangled up in, complex economic and ethical dilemmas.
Absolutely. This heist really brought to light some of the vulnerabilities within the maple syrup industry, how a seemingly secure system could be exploited, and the potential consequences of that disruption. It forced everyone involved to reevaluate security measures, supply chain integrity, and even the relationship between the QMSP and the producers they represent.
It's like that old saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And in this case, that weak link had some pretty sticky fingers.
And beyond the immediate impact on the industry, this story has also had a lasting cultural impact. It's become a kind of cautionary tale, a reminder of the complexities and challenges of managing a valuable and culturally significant resource. It's even been featured in documentaries and TV shows.
Oh, wow.
Further solidifying its place in pop culture.
It's kind of fascinating how this real-life heist has really captured the public's imagination. It's almost like something out of a movie.
It has all the elements of a great story. Intrigue, mystery, audacious characters, and of course a sticky sweet commodity at the heart of it all. But what elevates this story beyond mere entertainment is that it prompts us to think critically about our own relationship with resources, the systems we create to manage them, and the consequences when those systems break down.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the great Canadian maple syrup heist, what would you say is the most important thing for our listener to take away from all of this?
Well, I think it's about recognizing the human element within these larger systems, whether it's maple syrup or oil, diamonds, or any other valuable commodity. We need to remember that behind the economics, the regulations and the supply chains are individuals with their own motivations, frustrations, and dreams. And understanding those human factors is crucial if we want to create systems that are both efficient and equitable.
It's a good reminder that sometimes the sweetest things can have the most complicated stories.
Well, thanks for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive. It was my pleasure. And for you, dear listener, perhaps this story will spark your own curiosity next time you drizzle that maple syrup on your pancakes. Take a moment to think about the journey it took to get to your plate and all the stories it might have to tell.